Hey everyone, this is Mrs. McManus. This is just a screencast to cover the topic of prosecution and the different type of prosecutors that you'll see in our criminal justice system at both the state and federal level. So as you can see here, I have definitions of what prosecution, prosecuting attorney, and defense attorney are. So the prosecution is the side of the government. And so it's either the state or the federal government, and they're the ones that begin the process of bringing a criminal case forward. So as the police arrest a defendant, then they will be entered into the criminal justice system where the prosecutor will then decide to charge them or not charge them. They'll decide whether or not to go to trial or perhaps have a plea bargain. Do recall, I believe I've mentioned this before, that usually only about 10% of cases actually go to trial. So a lot of the prosecutor's work is actually beforehand, trying to decide whether to press charges and whether or not to enter into a plea with the defendant. So the attorneys are the ones, of course, that are the prosecutors, and then we also on the other side have the defense attorneys, and they're the ones who are the lawyers for the defendant, the person accused of the crime. So, um, for a long time, lawyers have been subjected to all kinds of criticism. For example, in early America, actually, lawyers were not even allowed. In Massachusetts, if you recall, we were established in 1620 in Plymouth and 1630 in Boston and Massachusetts Bay Colony. They actually didn't have lawyers, and people would represent themselves, and that's partially because the Puritans who settled here believed that the Bible was the law. And if the Bible also said that it was actually illegal for lawyers to take fees for their work. So they didn't have any lawyers back then. This changed roughly in the 1720s, so about 50 years prior to the American Revolution, where they started to see that lawyers were necessary in the trial process. Up and down has the population of lawyers gone throughout history. In the more recent past, I guess you could say, although it's not even that recent, but in the 1970s, there were some scandals, particularly with Richard Nixon, who was the president at the time, and there were some criminal activities of some of his lawyers during the Watergate scandal. And some of those who got involved had prison time, and according to one writer, quote, "The pedestal on which lawyers traditionally have been placed is crumbling faster than any other time in history." So why all this hostility? Well, we do know that lawyers yield a ton of power, right? They're the ones, if we're talking about prosecutors, who are the ones who are representing the government, right? And so some people say that the system is so complicated that is it the lawyers who have actually helped to create this system that only they are actually able to understand and manipulate? But one could ask too, is it the lack of understanding on our part, like sort of the common average Joe? Is it because we don't know enough about our system? Or maybe it's because we have differing opinions of what constitutes justice. So, going into an overview of the adversary system. In our criminal justice system in the United States, both the prosecution and defense are supposed to be diligent in trying to not only investigate witnesses, but to secure physical evidence on the behalf of their case. So remember that the prosecutors are the ones that have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant is guilty. But the defense attorney needs to also make sure that you guys can hear my dog over there. Needs to make sure that they defend the defendant to the best of their ability. That doesn't mean that they can do it at any cost, but sometimes that might mean that they have to do their own investigation, or that they might have to actually look for some evidence of their own as well. Remember that in our system, we emphasize the rights of the defendants. And so the prosecutor's job is to seek justice on behalf of the victim or on behalf of the state, but not at any price. They are not allowed to violate individual rights because we have our constitutional rights. So the history of the prosecution really is that in early America, the system was totally different. Sometimes the prosecution of criminal cases were actually left to the people who were victimized, although each colony did usually have a head prosecutor or an attorney general who could initiate this, but there was just sort of a lot of abuse in the system. Sometimes you actually saw that defendants would say, okay, how about I pay you money instead of me going to jail, because sometimes the punishments for these crimes were very severe. And so this actually really, if you think about it, equates to the fact that you can actually buy your freedom from criminal prosecution. But gradually, we have a system that develops where each county would bring local prosecutions to the county courts. These county courts started to be pretty autonomous, and today all states have some type of local and state prosecution system. So, some say, well, prosecutors are elected, right? So in the state of Massachusetts, they are. So they are really subject to some state politics and to some local politics. But some would argue, does that actually make them more accountable to the people who are voting them in? Massachusetts, in fact, has 11 elected district attorneys. But as we talked about in class the other day, district attorneys cannot, I mean, look at, they prosecute 300,000 cases annually, right? They cannot prosecute all these cases. So you'll see it makes sense that they have a staff of 1,500 employees with 700 prosecutors alone, and then usually about 250 witness victim advocates. There are people who kind of act sometimes as a go-between for people who might be the victims, and so because the prosecutor's caseload is usually just so large, as you can see. In Worcester County, our DA is Joseph D. Early Jr. So let's talk a little bit about the different kinds of prosecutors, because it actually does make a difference. In more rural areas, and I want you to think even more rural than, Harvard. I want you to think, let's go to another state. Think rural Kansas or Nebraska. The advantages to having a rural prosecutor in this area is that small towns and rural areas typically have lower crime rates. Now, this is, of course, a generalization, but typically do. And the caseloads then tend to be lighter, so the DAs tend to have more time to actually prepare for cases. Most court, or prosecutors, I should say, know other court personnel in the area. Although you could say the same thing even for like the Air District Court. If you walk into the Air District Court and you've tried, dozens of cases in there, or you've gone in there, for most of your career, then you could say the same. But cases are typically handled individually and close attention is paid to them. Most cases, though, interestingly enough, are settled by a guilty plea. And you might ask why. Well, rural judges and juries tend to be harsher, so attorneys don't often suggest going to a trial because it might not actually end in the defendant's favor. There's not typically a lot of crime in the rural areas either, so you tend to see, I should say, violent crime. So you tend to see things like thefts, property crimes, driving under the influence, vandalism, and so on. Some of the disadvantages, though, are that salaries tend to be low, and some prosecutors actually have to maintain their finances by opening up private law practices. Oftentimes, they might not have full-time staff, they might not have good office equipment, or even resources to investigate crimes. And if the sole prosecutor is out, let's say they have surgery or something like that, and they're out for weeks, then the court sometimes can't even process cases. Single prosecutor also will often have a hard time handling super complicated crimes, right? So if there's a murder in a small rural area, they might not have the people working for them as a full-time staff. They might not have adequate access to resources to handle these investigations. So oftentimes you'll see that they'll have to actually partner up with bigger cities and towns or perhaps the state police. Now, if we're going into sort of more suburbia, so perhaps you could think of, Harvard as more suburbia, though we may sort of straddle that line between rural as well. Typically, there's fixed crime patterns. What they mean by that is that the crimes in an area are, you don't see like spikes going up and down, on the chart or anything like that. Typically, they also have more funds and resources than rural areas, and that's because you have a bigger population which has a larger tax base. Sometimes you see land development also brings in money and taxes, and so they might have some more funds and resources. Urban prosecutors face a very different caseload than the rural ones. A lot of differences in types of crime rates. You'll actually see for prosecutors that they might be assigned to particular departments. For example, in, let's say, New York City, You might have assistant district attorneys who work homicide cases. You might have another group who work, sexual assault cases, like think SVU, like Law and Order, right? You might have another department that handles like vice cases and so on and so forth. Um, the crime rates typically are higher in urban areas and oftentimes are violent crimes as well. And the caseloads are going to be a lot higher too. Sometimes, honestly, urban prosecutors are so busy that they might get the files of the cases and only have a few minutes to look at them before they arrive into court to prosecute the cases. And we're talking about less serious offenses. Typically, if it is a murder case or a really big felony, they would spend more time looking at that to see should they offer a plea bargain, what they should ask for bail, should they remand the person to prison instead of giving them bail, and so on and so forth. Salaries, it's interesting. Prosecutors, you would think it's going to depend on the state, I should say, but in Massachusetts, the ADAs are actually paid shockingly low comparatively to some other states and some other professions even. And so we'll talk a little bit more about this in class, but typically in the urban areas, they tend to be paid a little bit higher. But staff turnover is really pretty high. This could be because of the maybe non competitive salaries. It also could be burnout. I mean, their caseloads are usually ginormous. But it also could be, too, that a lot of lawyers will actually enter in as an ADA to kind of get their feet wet and to kind of sort of get the experience. And then they may move on after a short amount of time to another, perhaps they run for DA or perhaps, they go into private practice instead. Offices, this is totally a generalization as well, but typically you have more staff. They are better equipped, especially, like I said, because they have higher caseload. They kind of have the need for that. So prosecutions, of course, our prosecution systems will differ from state to state. In Massachusetts, though, and in fact, every state is headed by an attorney general. And so I want you to think of the attorney general as kind of like the head lawyer in our state, right? And so you'll see too that we have one at the national level, which we'll talk about in a minute. So in Massachusetts, our attorney general is named Maura Healey. She was elected into the position, and so she is the chief lawyer. She's the chief law enforcement officer. Not only does she handle criminal stuff, but you'll see she'll handle consumer protection cases, fraud, corruption cases. In fact, if you were to go to her website and look at some of the cases that she's taken on, it's really interesting to look at any attorney general's website because you're like, wow, I didn't know that the attorney general would, get involved in something like that. So really a wide variety of stuff. The federal prosecution system is obviously on a much larger scale, and those prosecutors are not called district attorneys, they're called U.S. attorneys. One U.S. attorney will head each of the 93 U.S. federal judicial districts. So we have at least 93 U.S. attorneys, right? But that doesn't mean that there aren't more as well. And they are appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate. They and their assistant U.S. attorneys, like I just mentioned, and other attorneys in the Department of Justice have jurisdiction over all federal laws. So if we're talking, terrorism, if we're talking drug trafficking, kidnapping that crosses state lines, a serial killer who has gone on a rampage through many states, right? Anything that would be federal would be under the jurisdiction of the U.S. attorneys. The Department of Justice, though, I do want to point out real quick, is made up of so many lawyers. There's lots and lots of them, and they aren't always like prosecutors, meaning they aren't always in the courts prosecuting stuff. I just thought I should mention that because we did talk the other day about the Solicitor General and others who act as defense lawyers for the government in certain aspects as well. And so the U.S. Department of Justice, the head of that department is the Attorney General, and they're appointed by the President and confirmed by the Senate. So they serve actually on the President's cabinet. So I want you to think of, if you could think of like the Department of State, the head of the Department of State is the Secretary of State, right? The head of the Department of Treasury is the Secretary of the Treasury. So we don't have a Secretary of the Department of Justice. The person who's in charge of that is actually the Attorney General. So the U.S. attorneys actually they are answer to the Attorney General. And they're generally free, interestingly enough, to kind of develop their own priorities in their district. So some say that this actually might lead to better job satisfaction and allows for flexibility to concentrate on crimes that are characteristic to specific areas. So for example, you might see in certain parts of the country that, I don't know, drug trafficking might be more prevalent in particular parts of the country. So the U.S. attorneys might actually focus on prosecuting those type of cases, right? You might see in another part of the country that perhaps, sorry, I'm even blanking. Um, Terrorism and domestic terrorism is, or let's say the mob, right? Crimes that have to do, like if you're thinking like Whitey Bulger, right? Something like that. Then you might see attorneys who might be more interested in specializing in those kinds of cases. So they're kind of allowed to sort of have that discretion to sort of decide to prosecute those cases or not, really. So that is it for the screencast. I should have mentioned that hopefully you paused it along the way so you could kind of fill in the notes as you went along. If you have any questions, please do make sure to ask me in class and I would be happy to answer them. Thanks.